Hello everybody and welcome to the 79th edition of the Frank and Stan Chat, and we have another guest with us this week. It's Lucy Trueman. Hello Lucy.
Hi.
Hello. We'll come back to you and allow you to sort of introduce yourself to everybody, but we'll go over to Stan. How are you, Stan? Obviously at home.
I'm still at home. Yeah, it's pouring down outside. It's horrible, but yeah, it's
well, we've got our winter jumpers on, Stan.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're into late November. It's Black Friday, I believe. This day passes me by, you know what I mean? It's just nothing to me. But anyway, I'm in North Wales and it's very windy here and dry but windy. So Lucy, hello, thank you for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself so everybody knows who you are and perhaps how you know Stan?
Yeah, so I'm Lucy Trueman. I've got a management consultancy which specialises in change management in the public sector. So my sort of thing that I'm really interested in at the moment is the impact of COVID on organisations and how they manage leadership, how they make change happen, and really what the impact is in that relationship between leaders and staff going forward. In the public sector specifically, and I do some work in education as well. But I've known Stan for a number of years, so Stan was my manager many years ago.
Wow, dear me, I didn't know that.
Years ago.
God, it's nice to know someone made something of their career, Lucy, after an experience with Stan.
So yeah, I've had Trueman Change for 7 years, and then I worked somewhere else for 2 between. So yeah, quite a few years ago. But yes, I learned lots from Stan about leadership and management, and yes, I'll let Stan
admit that on
there.
You learned a lot. Was it of any use, Lucy? Yes.
Yes, of course it was.
Anyway, well, it's lovely to have you. And after we've done what's called our eye this week, then we'll perhaps come back to you and you can explain a little bit more about what you've been doing. So Stan, what's caught your eye this week?
Well, you'll know that I was at a funeral last week, I think, and I was at one 2 weeks before that, which seems to be that I'm the messenger of doom at the moment.
Yeah, but you're always wearing that white shirt, Stan, the only white shirt you've got.
It's that black tie. I've got a theory that you wear them 3 times before you put them back in the cupboard. But it's a legacy. It was, you know, sitting through a funeral service and hearing people say all the things that they do say about how this person's missed, etc. But you always get one nugget at the end where somebody says, and this is how we'll remember them. And the 2 that recently have been, one, his loving for shepherd's pie, and another one which was how much they like to watch Sky Sports on the TV. And I think there's got to be more to your life at the end of it to be celebrated by I used to like.
Well, Stan, I don't know what you mean. I mean, I think those are perfectly acceptable things to enjoy as you get older.
Well, the thing about that particular person was, and I find this fascinating, he was born in a house in Salford, and he actually, I mean, he was very ill towards the end of his life, but his ambition was to go back to the house, which he did. So he died in the house he was born in Salford. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
But maybe nobody else at the funeral was willing to chat to me about that.
Okay,
so,
Lucy.
Yeah, like legacy, what are people remembered for?
Yeah, yeah. I had something like that this week as well, because I was contacted by a teacher who I taught probably 20 odd years ago, taught with 20 odd years ago. And she was talking about the impact I had, and it's funny, you know, you do these things because it's you. You know, I didn't do anything because in effect, I suppose I was influenced by things I read and my own experiences and people I spoke to. But actually, at the end of the day, you know, I am me, and it was me that was the leader, you know, and the way that I have been brought up and the way that I like to be treated and what have you, that's how I try to treat the staff. And in a way, trying to respond to that email, you know, you can't just say, well, that's just because it's me, you know. I mean, you had to say, oh, well, I was influenced by this or that and whatever. But actually, it was just from the heart. I just led because that's, you know, I led the way that I wanted to make people feel, you know, and to encourage them. So it was quite hard to respond to.
I don't think we need to go on about how we were as leaders, especially as somebody who knows the truth.
Oh. Well, now Lucy, what's your line this week?
So for me, it was the really cringy, awful speech by Nick Fletcher, who was basically saying that young men are turning to crime because Doctor Who's a woman was the upshot of it, which was quite funny to listen to as a woman. And quite sad in a way. And I do think there's probably some nugget in there about, you know, do we need to think about role models, especially in education, for boys and men, and I do completely support that. But yeah, it was just one of those things where that got lost along the way. It's, you know, we're not people aren't turning to crime because Doctor Who's a woman and because Ghostbusters was remade with women, and in a funny way it just acknowledges what women have been saying all along, which is that we need some role models that are not just about being a sidekick to a male narrative.
Yes.
But yeah, that pushback is very interesting, I think, and I think from a professional point of view it's interesting that you think, do people think like that in the workplace? Do people think that as women are progressing and getting better jobs, and, you know, is there that sense of loss for men, which is really sad? But yeah, it was, I have a feeling that he's backpedaling quite rapidly because of how ridiculous it sounds, but there is something about role models, but I don't think that's it.
I saw a great tweet afterwards that said, yes, but think of all those women who would have turned to crime who are now considering going through time through the universe.
I mean, yeah. The thing is, though, is that he knew that this was going to be recorded. You know, you would have thought that you know, was he just reading something somebody else wrote for him?
I don't know. I thought that because he wasn't reading it. There was no passion in what he was saying, and I wondered whether, as he was reading it for the first time, he was perhaps thinking, "Where's this going?" Because now I've talked about Luke Skywalker, who, who, as far as I'm aware, was never replaced by a woman.
I was thinking that. I was like, is this a spoiler? I don't remember this.
But actually, it runs neatly into Peppa Pig, doesn't it? Because actually, I mean, the Peppa Pig speech from Prime Minister, and also his references to cars and vroom, vroom, and all this sort of stuff. You know, this is what happens when you veer away from your script and you're not really on the ball. You know, I mean, and the thing for me is, all of those business leaders, you know, they'd all given up their day to hear the Prime Minister talk about the future of its industrial strategy for the Northeast, you know. And actually, you know, as somebody said, it's probably not a good idea to talk about Peppa Pig World, which in a way, even on a good run, is probably about 5 hours driving away from where the Northeast is, you know.
And ask people to put their hands up who've been
there, yeah. But the thing is that then led to all ministers probably this week being asked, either on the radio, television, or in private, about what they know about Peppa Pig. And Dominic Raab was interviewed about, you know, how well he knew about Peppa Pig, and he said, well, I remember sitting down with my parents and watching the program and everything. Well, of course, somebody then worked out that Peppa Pig began in 2004, and he would have been in his 30s. You know, I mean, and the point we make here is not about, you know, ridiculing ministers. I mean, in a way, there's a bit of that, but actually, the bigger point is about, you know, I've worked for head teachers who've tried to do this, senior leaders who've tried to do this, you know, to sort of try and egg up what they've done, and then it all starts to unravel. You know, it's like when you're trying to, you know, you've done perhaps something wrong at home, and you think, oh, well, I'll just tell a little white lie here, this will sort of get around it. And then it's a bit like Macbeth, you know, it all comes back to haunt you, you know, over time, you know. So, and in a way, they just need to be much more upfront and say, well, actually, I'm not very familiar with Peppa. I think a lot of people go, well, I'm not very familiar with Peppa Pig. If you haven't got young children, I'm not going to sit in front of the television watching Peppa Pig. You know, or if Dominic Raab said, I've got far too many things to be doing, you know, than watching Peppa Pig. I'm really sorry. Perhaps I ought to spend a bit more time. But they can't bring themselves to say that. They've got to join in. And it's that bit that does my head in, really.
Yeah, I remember interviewing somebody for a post, and part of it was their sort of industry relationships with education. And this guy explained how he'd written this piece on the development of Salford Quays as an educational opportunity. And he spoke about it quite well. And the governors, I think it was governors, it might have been senior staff, were quite impressed till I pointed out that I'd actually written that. The candidate who was claiming it.
Oh well, I mean, I just don't know. I mean, just when you the other issue that's been big news is the migrant issue, isn't there? And again, this is around, you know, getting on well with people, isn't it? If the government are going to resolve this, they need to have a really effective relationship with partners.
You know, the news this morning.
No, I haven't. No.
In the news this morning, French have cancelled the meetings following a letter from Boris Johnson. Yeah. So whatever his letter was, diplomatically, like a kick-in, I think.
Yeah, it's in a way. I'm taken by a head teacher who's going to be a guest on our chat in the new year, who has major problems with traffic at his college, and so he's out there with his yellow jacket on and everything, and he blogs every day about the problems he's having with it, you know. But actually what he's trying to do is to keep in with his neighbors, because the issue is not so much the school, it's there are risks there, but it's the inconvenience all of this has with poor parking and poor dropping off on the people who live opposite him, you know. So he's working his socks off to try and keep everybody happy, you know, trying to keep the safety of it, but also trying to keep his neighbors on board with him. And you know, let's face it, having good neighbors where we live, where I've lived there for over 30 years, we've got fantastic neighbors, is probably one of the reasons why we might not move. You know, we don't quite like the house, we've perhaps ought to downsize, but who are the neighbors going to be, you know? So for us, it's crucially important. And for the government, I would have thought getting on with our sort of international neighbors, I would have thought is top priority.
Our friends.
But anyway, I live somewhere else.
That we always call them now. I mean,
yeah.
We always call them our European friends.
Okay, Lucy, just tell us a little bit about the work you do then.
So I help public sector organisations to rethink how they do change, and but I've been really inspired by the events of COVID. So last year, I lost my dad to COVID in the first lockdown. And he died on the 3rd of April, so it was very, very early on. I think we went into lockdown, didn't we, late March?
Yes.
And he was in hospital. It was hospital-acquired COVID, and it was, I think they're better at it now and a bit more empathetic, but at the time it was the second that somebody was diagnosed, you could have no contact with them. We couldn't even get through to the ward. It was really difficult. And I think similar to yourselves with your podcast, I started to do, so I have my own business, so there was all of that pressure, and I thought, well, I need to sort of get back to work, but I don't know how to do it without it all being about COVID, and when you've just lost somebody and it's so raw, it was a difficult time. But there was just this nugget of curiosity of, actually, there's a lot of really interesting things happening. And as somebody that's grown up in the public sector, as I said, I worked for Stan for a number of years. A lot of radical transformation and change happened extremely quickly because people had to. And so I started by having these online discussions similar to this with people from different parts of the public sector, people from education, from local government, from health, to ask, how are you doing this? Like, what is happening? How are you making this happen so quickly? And that was enough to sort of pull me a bit out of the grief and of COVID being this incredibly sort of overwhelming thing, to being this thing that actually there is some interesting things there. There's some curious things. So we ran quite a lot of these panel discussions, and then I've pulled all that together. So I'm drafting a book at the moment in what are the findings of that. And really the question that I'm trying to answer is, what does organisational change in the public sector look like post-COVID? Because I think what's really interesting is that when it happened, people who worked in all sectors, but particularly the public sector, because I think the private sector had in many ways some buffers in terms of things like furlough. There were certain key workers that obviously the work had to continue, but in the public sector, the response had to be immediate, and staff really stepped up. They really, really stepped up. They went to remote working. They went to, you know, completely change their jobs. Some of the councils that I've worked with completely reconfigured what people were doing.
Yes, I mean, I had
closed. And
sorry, Lucy, I had a friend who, I've got a friend who works in the health service, and she was a sort of a senior director, but she ended up going back onto sort of, you know, some manual work to just, you know, I think she worked in the supplies department, and actually didn't feel any remorse about that, because there was a, you know, this was something everybody had to do, you know, and I think that was important for her. I think it was, you know, everybody had to prove that they, you know, that in a sense, the care and the health of the nation was the reason that drove them to this job, you know, and this was a point whereby they had to prove to others as well as to themselves how serious they were about that.
I think there's been a real shift, or there has to have been a real shift to management from leadership, because during the pandemic, it was about managing things. It wasn't there wasn't as much leadership, because there wasn't the choices for leaders to say we're going to go this way or we're going to go that way. It was like all hands on the deck, and it turned into a and I think what it showed in the public sector and in schools is actually we're quite good at managing and doing the best we can in the resources we've got in the short amount of time. We're really quite good at that. I've talked to some head teachers who've only been in headship for 2 years, and I've got some concerns that when this, if it ever gets to some sort of normal again, that they won't have the leadership development that they'll need to start to lead the school as opposed to manage the school. Because at the moment, well, not so much now, but certainly in the last 12 months, everything they've had to do has come as a directive. You need to do this, in this circumstance, do this, talk to public health in this circumstance. And so they've had to manage that rather than make those key decisions themselves. I think there's going to be some stress once we get back to a normal where leadership is suddenly important again. And I'm hoping that those heads that have not tried it yet are okay in that first 2 or 3 years. I think it'll be a real challenge.
So what about the fragility, Lucy? Sorry, you were going to say?
Well, I was going to say, I do agree with the management from that sort of task perspective, but one of the things I've seen is an increase in sort of humanity. Which is probably a bit more on the leadership styles that side. So it's less leadership about, as you say, people didn't really have a choice of what to do, so they were mandated to. But one of the things that I do think has been quite positive is a level of authenticity, that it almost made it okay for leaders to be like, you know what, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the government's going to say at 5 o'clock on the briefing. You know, I'm reacting just as much as you are. And I think I did see a big breakdown of hierarchy and a sense of mucking in, and also an acceptance of the emotional impact of it all, which sometimes we're not very good at. Sometimes, you know, we're not very good at connecting with that human side and accepting that people are going to be struggling and people are scared. You know, I've seen hundreds of big organisational change programs where people sort of idly talk about the change curve but don't really care how anybody feels, and yet the pandemic brought that humanity to it. So I think you're right in terms of being able to lead and having some say over that, and look, you know, kind of pointing an organisation in a direction. But I think there's been some positive learnings around.
I agree. I really do agree, and I think the very fact that people are having to say I don't know is a real positive. I just wish, and we've said this before, you know, at national level, why can't the leaders say I don't know, rather than I'll find out, or let me check that and I'll come back to you, not make up something and hope that gets us through. Because as you say, Dominic Raab watching Peppa Pig with his mum and dad aged 30 doesn't to me sound as though that really happened.
No. But the fragility, the thing that's worried me a little bit, Lucy, is, you know, we had a system whereby, for right or wrong, particular types of leaders or particular leaders were actually judged as being effective. And actually, they probably lived behind that cloak of effectiveness, you know, but actually the COVID presented new challenges. And I'm interested in terms of how did those sort of confident, I know what I'm doing sort of head teachers, you know, we're on an upward curve, you know, how they actually coped emotionally with the challenges that COVID brought. You know, I think it's brought out, as Stan said, I've seen, because I've got a relative who is a primary head teacher, who is one of these, come on, you've got to do it. We get, you know, standards of everything, and it's in a sort of tough area. I understand all that. And I think he has been amazing at the way that he has shown a sensitivity in his leadership, which I think none of us saw. You know, he was able to immediately communicate much more readily with his community, you know, than we'd ever give him credit for before the COVID. We thought, you know, this was just not in his DNA at all. So I do think there are some, you know, when we get out of this, you know, it's important, I think, that the systems around leadership, how we value, how we judge them, you know, that has to embrace this, because people have found themselves, you know, they've learned something about themselves, and we need to enable them, I think, to progress this, you know, forward, and not have a sort of view as to, well, this is what effective leadership is. You've got to go for your standards and all this sort of stuff, and there's a certain way of doing it. I think we've really, you know, I think we do need to be really open to the response that people have made to COVID.
I used to talk to heads that were on induction and say that the biggest secret of all heads is that at times you get hurt. And it's such a secret that nobody bothers to tell anybody else. So nobody puts their hand up to say, actually, I've been hurt by that, because it's just not what you do.
Yeah.
And so everybody gets hurt, but nobody shares that feeling because they're scared of makes them look weak. And I'm hoping that that's something will break, where people do have colleagues, have friends, have groups of similar minded people, and they say, look, I'm in a bit of a mess this week. I could do with some support from you. That, I think, would be great.
Have people used you in that way, Lucy?
Yeah. So we are sometimes that kind of support function. So we specialise in change. So when we're working with an organisation that is making change happen, sometimes the senior leaders in that organisation do need that safe place, because there is that fear of being judged, but I have seen that reduce, and that's the part that I think can't go back. And I do see some organisations trying to go back. I feel like some people are trying to put that mask back up, and I think from a staff perspective, you know, the people that were working from home with kids crawling around and animals crawling around the feet, and you know, that managed to make all that happen and feel valued and have that authenticity from their leaders, for us to now pull back, I think that's such a huge mistake. You know, we can't put that back in the box.
No,
I don't think.
And also, I mean, this morning there is news of a South African variant which is much more transmissible. You know, I'm not suggesting that we'll go into another lockdown, but actually I think leaders need to be mindful of what the future might look like, you know, and this sort of, well, let's get back, you know, actually you're veering from one thing to another. You know, I think this does need a very careful hand on the tiller, you know, and actually, you know, wherever people want to get to, you know, they need to do it in a timely way, you know, not feel as though they've got to be rushed into getting there. And I think some of the stuff Stan and I have been doing this week over Ofsted, I think actually is about that. You know, there's a bit of a drive to get back. You know, we're not going to use COVID as an excuse sort of thing, but actually head teachers are thinking about, well, actually, you know, the future might be a bit different to what we had in the past. And I'm a bit wary of going too quickly at this, you know.
There was a piece in, not certain which paper it is, so I won't name it, but about, you know, time for working from home has gone now, and you need to be back in the office and working, blah, blah. And the usual, and on Twitter, somebody put a little thing underneath it just to say, just to remind you, the author of this lives in Florida.
Yes,
writing for a British paper, clearly working from his home. The hypocrisy is unbelievable.
Yeah.
One
So
thing I would be curious to ask you to, because obviously you're much more specialist in education than I am, is with that in mind, that the future world of work is radically different. And I do find one of the things interesting about working from home is that, you know, it does require a different skill set, and I don't think it is going away. I think in my business we're reducing it in that we meet up every few weeks, but we don't have an office. You know, we're all based in different places around the country. I'm curious, what's the
yeah,
educational response to that? How do we skill up young people to go into a working world that's actually quite hard for us to even imagine? You know, when you think how different the last 2 years have been, what's it going to be like 10 years from now? How does education respond to that?
Well, part of the problem is, Lucy, that we've got an ideology at the moment that education's about learning facts.
Yeah.
And so we are pumping knowledge into children and not developing skills. And of course, the ability to be flexible, to work in different working environments and to work with different groups of people are all skills that need to be developed. They're all the skills that industry want, but at the moment, that's not on the curriculum agenda.
I think Mike Rotherham, Dr. Rotherham, who was on here in March or February when it was saying how much his daughter had gained from home working. And of course, this then becomes a bit of a social mobility issue, a social justice issue, because if you're like Mike, you can imagine what life's like at home there. You know, it's all set up. You know, there's probably quite an academic sort of feel to it. You know, that's a good environment for a child to be supported in their learning. But of course, other families are not set up in quite that way, and they're not as well resourced, you know. But actually, I was really sad when the chief inspector said, and the Secretary of State said, you know, we've got to get back to children being in front of a class, in a classroom, in front of a teacher. And I'm thinking, but actually, there are lots of kids for whom this homeworking, which is what it's been, home learning, has been really beneficial. So we need to think about, well, is there a way in which we could embrace more of that, you know, and actually develop this sense of independent learning, you know, in the way that you're doing, Lucy, today, and we're doing as well. You know, you're given a task to do, you've got some time to do it, you've got to get on with it, you know. And actually, I think children, you know, there are some children out there for whom getting back into the classroom is something they don't want to do. And the numbers of young people being taught at home now, you know, there's a report on it this week, but I know I'm involved in Blackpool. We're very concerned about the number of children that are not returning to school, you know, who for one reason or another don't feel confident enough, or don't feel that it's going to improve their chances. And these are not people that, you know, from families where you think, well, actually, you know, they can't be bothered. These are very motivated families, you know, who have seen that actually, I think our children are making more progress at home than they did at school. So, you know, there needs to be a much more sort of a menu, or a different type, you know, a range of approaches that can be used. Because putting children back in class, I don't think that's going to be the answer for everybody.
Oh, the head I was talking to this week said that they've almost slid into this approach now, that when children are off ill, but not too ill to be able to work, or when they're isolated, they just go on to online learning, and they are a laptop in the classroom. So it's a Teams, I think it is, or Google Classroom or something like that, where on the desk is a laptop with a child's face in it, and they're taking part in the lesson as much as anybody else.
Yeah.
It's more stress on the teacher because they have to make sure there's electronic version of the work to go home, etc. So it is more workload on teachers. But the way he was describing it, we've kind of adopted it without that much of a big challenge. And so I think there will be a case, if we're flexible enough, of people who want to do home learning, but, and you like the term, buy in to a school who provide them with a range of lessons. Sold.
Yeah, it makes me wonder whether post 16 some of that's going to be, you know, it might be Tuesday and Thursday it's home, you know, and actually, you know, there are tasks to do. There may be some online learning and whatever going on, but actually, you know, you can see how that would prepare young people perhaps better for university life, which again, has been disrupted severely by all of this. But actually, that's what the world of work is looking like more and more. So I think I can't see this government doing that. I can't. But actually, if it was left to people like ourselves, I think we'd probably want to trial it and give it a go, and be encouraged to give it a go to see what the outcomes are, and to assess it fairly. The key thing is the children in this as well, isn't it? No one's asked the children what they want. I would have thought you get to 16, you should be asked these things. Yeah, sorry, Stan.
Lucy's companies can do evaluations on project work.
Yes,
so
we
you're
do.
talking
And if you put the code Frank and Stan chat, there's a 10% discount. Oh dear. Okay. Well, actually, we didn't get on to. Do you know what? That's over 30. Getting on for it's 32 minutes there. So, have we got time for Ofsted now, or should we leave that for next week?
Let's
Stan?
leave that for another time.
Give it a break. Yeah. So Lucy, Lucy, just before we finish, who are you currently helping? What sort of organisations, and how would people who perhaps want to connect with you make contact with you?
And so I'm quite active on LinkedIn. So my name's Lucy Trueman. So do feel free to contact me on LinkedIn. At the moment, we're working with a range of local authorities. And I said at the start of this call, I was going to put my dog out of the room.
I can hear him. Don't worry.
The dog would misbehave, but the rabbit would be fine. I don't know if you can see him in the corner, in a box. I also foster animals for animal charity, so there's always animal chaos going on around me at any given time. So yeah, at the moment we're working with Tamworth Council in the West Midlands on an organisational wide change programme. We're working with Birmingham City Council to do some co-design and co-production with different members of the community around some work, around some change that they want to make. And we've just started work with one in Scotland called Clackmannanshire, which again is about their approach to change. And I do work in London as well for Haringey, but we're based in Lancashire. We've done work for groups of schools who have received funding and then want to make a difference and do some school improvement, but want an independent evaluation, which we can provide. And actually we often work in partnership with Stan on those as well, to get that education expertise, as well as our kind of mapping out what's the change that you made, what was the outcome of that. So yeah, we're quite mixed really. We're very, very lucky that we get to work in different organisations and different sectors. And I very much fell in love with the public sector. I was brought up in double glazing, actually. My dad had a window company, but then he fell out with me when I went to uni. He said, I've not grown business up from nothing for you to go back to school, was his but he got over it, and we were very close. But yeah, I fell in love with the public sector, actually probably working for Stan. Although he did used to make fun of me of being more focused on the business performance.
Introduced a dirty word into the public sector called profit. wasn't a word we were used to using. We compromised on surplus eventually, I think.
That's a very good cooperative word. That's the term that co-ops use for profit. But anyway, Lucy, it's lovely to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you for inviting me.
No, it's a pleasure. And obviously, we'd love to invite you back next year if you're willing to join us. And Stan, we're on number 80 next week, so I think we've got a run now of a couple of guests who have been guests before, including the guest that's had the highest number of viewings. So we're going for a
not a competition, Lucy. Don't worry.
No. Anyway, I hope everybody has a good week, and yeah, we'll see you all being well next Friday. Cheerio.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.